They believed it was nothing more than a position abandoned during a chaotic retreat. A stretch of ground with no remaining tactical value, left only with snow, corpses, and silence. But in the biting cold of the European winter, one American soldier was still there alone, without comrades, without reinforcements, with only a foxhole, a machine gun, and the decision not to withdraw. When the German troops advanced, they did not realize that what stood before them was not the remnant of a collapsed defensive line, but a vital blocking point. 48 hours later, when the final gunfire faded, the Germans were forced to pull back, leaving more than 100 bodies scattered across the snow-covered battlefield, and a question never written into any operational order. How could a single American soldier stop an entire assault? In late 1944, deep within the dense forests of the Ardennes, blanketed by snow and ice, American soldiers huddled in shallow foxholes, their shoulders soaked, their hands stiff with cold, holding every meter of ground under the harshest conditions they had ever endured. Behind them, machine gun nests dug low to the frozen earth continued to spit fire in support of Sherman tanks bogged down in mud and snow, struggling to keep open the roads leading into the town of Bastogne as German forces slowly tightened the encirclement. It was December 1944. The moment Nazi Germany launched its final gamble on the Western Front, opening the campaign history would remember as the Ardennes Offensive, or the Battle of the Bulge. With roughly 250,000 troops, supported by thousands of tanks and artillery pieces, German forces smashed through the thin Allied lines in the Ardennes region of Belgium and Luxembourg, creating a bulge nearly 80 kilometers deep into the American front and threatening to split the entire northern Allied force in two. Weather became Germany's unexpected ally. A record-breaking winter swept across Western Europe, with heavy snowstorms and thick fog nearly paralyzing Allied air power, preventing effective reconnaissance and close air support. Under these conditions, German armored and infantry units were able to advance with minimal detection, applying relentless pressure on American defensive lines that were already beginning to crack. Along this axis of advance, Bastogne quickly emerged as an objective that could not be ignored. The town mattered not for its size, but for its location, a critical road junction with 7 major routes radiating in all directions. If Bastogne fell, German forces could split the Allied armies and open the way toward the Meuse River and beyond. For that reason, in just a matter of days, Bastogne was transformed from a quiet town into the focal point of one of the fiercest battles of the final months of World War II. As the encirclement began to tighten, the defenders of Bastogne found themselves in an extremely fragile position. Most of the American units present were fragments of formations retreating in haste after the initial defeats, disorganized, short on supplies, and often lacking even basic information. In a very short time, roughly 12,000 troops from the 101st Airborne Division, along with elements of American armor and artillery, managed to converge on Bastogne to establish a defensive line whose importance was nothing less than vital. From December 19 to the 21st of December 1944, German forces completed the full encirclement of the town, cutting off every ground supply route. Artillery fire was almost constant. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble, ammunition dumps were destroyed, and field hospitals were repeatedly struck by shells. On December 22, the Germans delivered an ultimatum demanding that the American garrison surrender in order to avoid unnecessary losses. The reply from Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe consisted of a single word: nuts. It was not merely a refusal, but a declaration that Bastogne would not surrender, no matter the cost. It was in this moment of being surrounded on all sides when cold, hunger, and relentless psychological pressure were wearing down every soldier that Sergeant Frank Russo entered the story as a quiet, uncelebrated hero. Russo, 28 years old, a former mechanic from Detroit, had been assigned with his engineer armor unit to hold a forward defensive position east of Bastogne, one of the most dangerous avenues of approach for German forces. In the opening days of the campaign, He witnessed German assaults smash through American positions with terrifying speed. In just 2 days, 3 defensive positions around his sector were overrun one after another, under overwhelming enemy fire. Familiar faces vanished from the line, and in the initial clashes alone, 14 of Russo's comrades were killed. Their deaths left more than gaps in the ranks. They created a sense of urgency that could not be ignored. Russo understood all too clearly that Bastogne was standing on the edge of collapse. If the eastern defensive line gave way, German forces would pour into the town, and thousands of American soldiers to the rear would be encircled or destroyed. In that moment, the instincts of a soldier fused with the mindset of a mechanic. Russo knew he could not wait for orders or for a miracle from outside. He decided to prepare on his own for the coming fight to the death. Using everything he had, driven by a single thought. If the Germans were to be stopped, they would be stopped right here, even if he had to do it alone. Late on the night of December 18, as the final artillery barrages subsided and the front sank into a fragile, deceptive calm, Sergeant Russo left his fighting position and quietly slipped into a maintenance tent hidden behind the defensive line. It was a makeshift collection point for damaged vehicles, shattered engines, and battlefield trophies taken from the Germans during the opening clashes. Under the dim glow of an oil lamp, smoke blackened the canvas ceiling. Russo stood still for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the darkness, then began to scan every corner, like a mechanic searching for parts for a machine that was about to be pushed to its absolute limit. In one corner of the tent, beneath layers of dirty snow and twisted metal, he spotted the wreckage of a recently destroyed German ST, KFZ 251, half-track. The hull was scorched, the engines smashed beyond repair, but the weapon mounts and gun fittings were still largely intact. Scattered nearby were ammunition belts, feed boxes, and most notably, the mounting bracket of an MG-42 machine gun, a weapon every infantryman learned to fear. Russo crouched down and examined it closely. And in that moment, the mindset of a soldier gave way to the instincts of a mechanic. He understood perfectly the deadly difference between two philosophies of firepower. The American Browning M1919 was reliable and accurate, but it had a critical weakness. It was not designed for sustained, continuous fire. After a few hundred rounds, the barrel would overheat to the point where firing had to stop to prevent jamming or warping. The German MG-42, by contrast, was built for attritional warfare. Its quick-change barrel system allowed the gun crew to maintain almost uninterrupted fire, resuming within seconds. The Germans understood that in infantry combat, sustained firepower was not only about killing the enemy, but about pinning them down and breaking the will to advance. And facing the reality of a besieged Bastogne, Russo realized that if he fought strictly by the book, his machine gun position would never hold once the Germans launched their concentrated assaults. That realization led him to a clear conclusion. If he could not change barrels as quickly as an MG-42, then he had to find a way to keep the Browning's barrel cool enough to keep firing. Army regulations strictly prohibited unauthorized modifications to weapons. Russo knew that. He also knew that violating those rules could mean a court-martial if he survived the battle at all. But at that moment, dry regulations carried no weight. 14 comrades had been killed in just the past 2 days, a number he could not ignore. He no longer thought about legal consequences, only about how to make sure the men still alive would not die for nothing. Russo went to work as if he were back in a machine shop in Detroit. He stripped down the Browning M1919, laying each component on the oil-soaked floor of the tent, checking the barrel, the bolt, the feed system. From the wreckage of the German half-track, he cut away a section of the engine's cooling pipe, shaping it by hand and with a hammer until it fit snugly around the barrel. It was not an elegant design, but it was something that could work. He fashioned a crude water jacket around the barrel, then scavenged a small hand pump and a usable container. Each joint was tightened carefully, every section of tubing secured with wire and metal clamps taken from battlefield salvage. For hours on end, in the biting cold of the night and under the flickering light of the oil lamp, Russo worked without pause. There were no blueprints, no instructions, only experience and instinct. When he finally pumped water through the improvised system and saw it begin to circulate around the barrel, he knew he had created something the Browning M1919 had never been meant to have. Before dawn, Russo mounted the modified machine gun onto a solid gun cradle taken from a German vehicle, allowing smoother traverse and better balance during sustained fire. When he stepped back to look at what he had built, it was no longer a standard machine gun, but a tool created for a single purpose: to fire continuously until the Germans could advance no farther. Russo returned to his fighting position with a cold, settled resolve. He knew that this machine gun post could become the final blocking point of the entire eastern defensive line of Bastogne. And if it came to that, he was prepared to turn it into a fortress, even if it cost him his life. In the early hours of the 19th of December, 1944, snow fell so heavily that it swallowed every contour of the sparse forest east of Bastogne, turning the battlefield into a flat, frozen white expanse where sound itself seemed smothered by wind and ice. Temperatures dropped to nearly -20 degrees Celsius. The cold did not merely bite the skin, but crept deep into the joints, freezing each breath into white vapor before the mouth. Under these conditions, Sergeant Frank Russo held his breath as he crouched in a shallow foxhole hastily dug along the forest edge, his shoulders stiff with clinging snow, his fingers numbed almost beyond feeling. Before him stretched an open expanse leading toward the town, a killing ground that, by every rule of warfare, German forces would have to cross if they hoped to break through the eastern defenses. Through the blurred curtain of falling snow, Russo began to notice subtle movements. At first, they were only small, dark specks shifting against the white. Then gradually they resolved into groups of men, advancing with discipline and purpose. He fixed his gaze on them, his heartbeat slowing in an oddly unnatural calm. They were German infantry, moving in successive groups, keeping their spacing, using every tree trunk and rise of ground for cover as they closed in. By Russo's estimate, at least 2 companies around 200 men had been committed to this axis of attack, tasked with smashing through the thin American defensive line and opening the way for the forces following behind. In the tense calm before the storm, he could also hear the low, throbbing sound of armored vehicle engines revving up behind the infantry formation, waiting for the moment the American line was breached so they could surge forward and deliver the final blow. The decisive moment had arrived. All stray thoughts vanished from Russo's mind. There was no fear, no doubt, only absolute focus on the task ahead. He glanced down at the modified Browning M1919 resting on the lip of the foxhole. The first 250-round belt, ready to feed. The improvised fittings and cooling pipes, snug around the barrel. The order from higher command still echoed in his head. Hold your fire. Do not shoot until the enemy is close enough. Russo brushed the snow from the barrel with the back of his hand, flipped off the safety, pressed his cheek against the stock, drew a deep breath, and waited. Suddenly, the sky seemed to collapse in a sharp, violent flash. A German flare shot upward and hung in the air, its cold, white-blue light illuminating the entire battlefield ahead. What followed was hell. German mortars and field guns opened up at once, pouring fire onto the American positions. The ground shook violently as snow was blasted skyward in thick, white clouds. Trenches shuddered, dirt, splintered wood, and debris rained down everywhere. American soldiers answered with rifle fire and whatever machine guns were still operational, but their numbers were too few and their fire scattered. In several places, American strongpoints were completely silenced by the artillery barrage. Sensing that the defensive line was beginning to waver, the Germans did not hesitate for a single second. Hundreds of infantrymen sprang up from their cover at once, charging forward, while shouting hoarse cries of, "Hurrah!" A sound that echoed through the trees, like a declaration of death. Within seconds, waves of gray uniforms surged ahead in dense formation, and the American forward defenses teetered on the edge of being completely overrun. But at that exact moment, Frank Russo's machine gun position finally spoke. He squeezed the trigger. The Browning bucked violently, its relentless roar tearing through the frozen silence. Muzzle flashes burst again and again, weaving a red-hot lattice of fire that swept across the attacking formation. German soldiers in the lead ranks were cut down almost instantly, their bodies collapsing face-first into the white snow. The sudden blow brought the assault to a halt for a brief but deadly instant. Seasoned veterans, however, the German troops reacted quickly. They scattered to either side, diving for cover while pouring heavy return fire toward Russo's position. Submachine gun rounds ripped into the edge of the foxhole, passing just inches from his head. Russo pressed himself flat against the wall of the hole, feeling each bullet slam into earth and wood beside his ears. Moments later, German machine guns joined in, their rounds shrieking through the air and hammering into the tree trunks ahead, shredding bark and splintering wood. In that instant, the situation became suffocatingly fragile. If his fire faltered for even a moment, the German infantry wave would pour across the open ground and swallow the entire defensive line. Russo knew it. He clenched his jaw, adjusted his aim, locked down on the trigger, and kept firing. Precise bursts skimmed at head height, forcing the attackers to hit the ground. Shouts and screams rang out as groups of German soldiers were hit, their initial confidence collapsing rapidly into panic. In less than 2 minutes, the first 250-round belt was spent. Under normal conditions, this would have been the moment when the Browning was forced to stop firing, its barrel overheated beyond safe limits. But this time, it didn't. The improvised cooling system began to do its job. Water inside the makeshift jacket boiled furiously, yet the barrel remained stable enough to keep firing. Russo quickly signaled to the ammunition bearer who had just scrambled to the edge of the foxhole. A fresh belt was fed in, the bolt slammed shut, and fire once again poured into the advancing formation. Short bursts, sharp, controlled, brutally precise. Each time the Germans regrouped to surge forward, Russo swept the line, turning entire clusters of men into motionless shapes scattered across the snow. Unable to break through with infantry alone, the Germans shifted tactics and unleashed their full firepower on his position. Mortar rounds slammed into the ground around the machine gun pit, dirt, rock, and metal fragments exploding outward, clanging violently against Russo's steel helmet. One artillery shell detonated against a tree just behind him, the blast tearing loose a massive chunk of earth and hurling Russo hard against the wall of the foxhole, leaving him stunned. Smoke and dust engulfed everything. Believing the strong point had finally been destroyed, a group of 4 German soldiers rushed forward, choosing close assault to finish off the position. But Russo was still alive. He forced himself upright, blood running from a small gash on his forehead, where a fragment had grazed him, his eyes shockingly clear. The machine gun had just run dry. He let it fall and instantly drew the pistol at his side. As the first German soldier vaulted into the lip of the foxhole, 2 shots cracked at point-blank range. The man collapsed instantly. The 2 behind him froze in panic and were immediately cut down by Russo's comrade with rifle fire. The desperate assault was broken in a matter of seconds. From morning until afternoon, the attacks came one after another, like waves endlessly crashing against a rocky outcrop in a frozen sea. On the eastern sector, the German axis of advance was nearly paralyzed by the fire of a single strong point. In a foxhole filled with snow and mud, Frank Russo almost alone held an entire stretch of the defensive line. The barrel of the gun glowed red, smoke billowed upward, and the snow around the pit melted into water. His gloves were soaked, his hands burned from the hot metal. But he did not stop. When the cooling water ran low, he shoveled snow into the improvised system and kept firing. His body shuddered with every burst, but his will never wavered. By late afternoon on December 19, the Germans were forced to pull back to regroup. In front of Russo's foxhole, more than 100 German bodies lay scattered across the white snow, marking the price paid for every meter of ground they had tried to seize. Russo finally released his grip on the machine gun, its barrel scorched black, exhausted to the point where he could not stand. His ears ringing from hours of continuous combat. Comrades dragged him out of the hole. Only then did he notice that his left arm was bleeding from a fragment embedded deep in the flesh. Russo merely gave a thin smile. Compared to surviving and holding the position, the wound meant nothing. Through the night of December 19 and throughout December 20, Bastogne remained under siege and constant shelling. The Germans committed additional forces, determined to break the resistance. Though wounded, Russo stayed with his unit, continued to fight, and showed his comrades how to apply the barrel cooling method he had devised. Thanks to that, American defensive firepower was sustained through the most critical hours. For the full 48 hours of encirclement, Bastogne did not fall, and part of that resilience came from a small foxhole east of the town, where Frank Russo stood his ground to the very end. On the 21st of December 1944, as the German operational clock began counting down toward Christmas, Bastogne became the focus of one last desperate effort. German artillery was reinforced to maximum strength. Salvo after salvo pounded the small town without pause, crushing snow-covered roads, destroying buildings, supply depots, and casualty collection points. Immediately after the bombardment, German infantry surged forward in successive mass assaults, hoping to shatter the defense before the Allies could react. But what they encountered was not a force on the brink of collapse, but the determination to hold at all costs displayed by the surrounded American soldiers above all the units of the 101st Airborne Division, men history would later remember by a simple, unyielding name, the Bastogne Boys. In numbing cold and amid shortages of ammunition, medicine, and even winter clothing, American strongpoints continued to hold, each street contested in blood. German assaults were broken one after another, not because of superior firepower, but because the attackers could not crush the will of soldiers who had accepted that there was no road left behind them. Bastogne held on hour by hour, day by day, until the tide of the battle began to turn. In the early morning of the 26th of December, 1944, from the south, the spearhead of George S. Patton's advance finally broke through the encirclement. The first American tanks appeared on the roads leading into Bastogne, bringing supplies, ammunition, and a clear message. The town had been held. When the ring was broken, the American flag was still flying over snowbound Bastogne, a definitive sign that Germany's final gamble in the Ardennes had failed. From that moment on, the Battle of the Ardennes entered an irreversible decline for the Germans, and the initiative on the Western Front gradually returned to the Allies. After the war, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill called Bastogne and the Battle of the Bulge as a whole the greatest battle ever fought by the United States Army, not only because of its scale or ferocity, but because it laid bare the true nature of the war. Human will could hold the field, even when every material condition was stacked against it. Within that victory were countless acts of heroism, but one of the most striking was the legend of the machine gunner Frank Russo. Armed with only a crudely modified Browning M1919 and roughly 2,000 rounds of ammunition, Russo held off a major German axis of advance for nearly 2 days, inflicting losses so severe that the enemy was forced to halt and reorganize. His feat never made wartime front pages, never became a subject of loud propaganda, perhaps because Bastogne contained too many larger battles, too many decisive strategic choices. But for those who stood beside him in the foxhole, the image of the thin sergeant, hands shaking from the cold, yet still pouring fire to hold every meter of ground, was unforgettable. Frank Russo survived Bastogne. His story endured not as a polished heroic epic, but as a stark, tragic legend born in the bloody maelstrom of the Ardennes. In that brutal winter, inside a snow-filled machine gun pit, the resolve of an ordinary soldier became the anchor of an entire defensive line. It was not merely a story of firepower or tactics, but of a single human being choosing to stand firm when everything around him was collapsing. And it was people like them who turned Bastogne into a symbol. They were flaming Christmas trees in the European winter of 1944, men who kept the light from going out in the darkest moment of the war. Their stand not only helped defeat Nazi Germany's final counteroffensive, but also left behind a heroic chapter in history, one defined by courage, endurance, and the enduring strength of the human spirit in World War II.